Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's jump right in because today we're unpacking a reality that is deeply tragic and, honestly, totally counterintuitive. When soldiers deploy to active war zones, we all understand the incredible risks to their physical and mental well-being, right? But what happens when they return home, physically safe, and are assigned to a desk job in a suburban strip mall? For a concerning number of these highly decorated combat veterans, coming home wasn't the end of their struggle. It was actually the beginning of an entirely different, unexpected battle. So, if I were to ask you right now, what is the toughest job in the military? What would you say? You might picture a frontline infantry soldier, maybe a special operations unit, or a bomb disposal expert. We naturally associate military hardship with direct combat, but to understand the true scope of the sacrifices made by our service members, we kind of have to challenge those assumptions completely. Because the answer, according to many who have actually served, is recruiting. I know, it sounds surprising, doesn't it? Yet for many decorated veterans, the most psychologically damaging battleground they ever faced wasn't a combat zone in Iraq or Afghanistan. It was a recruiting office. Paul Riekenhoff, the founder of the advocacy group Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, even went so far as to say that recruiting is arguably the toughest job in the military today. So we're going to dive into the data, the watchdog reports, and the tragic loss of life that really brought this hidden crisis to light. Section 1. The Houston Battalion Tragedy. We owe a huge part of our understanding of this dark chapter to the vital research of Dr. Ronnie Rodas. And actually, he wasn't just an outside observer. At the time, he was Sergeant Rodas, a combat-experienced NCO sent directly to the Houston Recruiting Battalion right after a tour in Iraq. This battalion covers a massive stretch of East Texas, and its story serves as a heartbreaking case study for a much wider systemic issue. Take a look at this timeline. These names aren't just statistics. These NCOs were actually part of Sergeant Rodas' own recruiting team. And we really want to honor their memories by understanding what they endured. Over just a 3-year period, 4 soldiers in the single battalion took their own lives. In 2005, Captain Rico Robinson shot himself. In 2007, Sergeant Niels Anderson, a Bronze Star recipient who survived 2 tours in Iraq, died by suicide. Then, in late 2008, things accelerated. Staff Sergeant Larry Flores hanged himself in his garage, and literally 6 weeks later, Sergeant First Class Patrick Henderson hanged himself in his backyard shed. Every single one of these men had served combat tours before being assigned to recruiting duty. This quote from Staff Sergeant Amanda Henderson really grounds these statistics in deep human grief. She was an Iraq veteran herself, a former recruiter, and the widow of Patrick Henderson. It perfectly captures the jarring psychological contrast these veterans faced. They survived the absolute horrors of war, where their valor and teamwork were celebrated, only to return to a stateside job where their entire worth was measured by a monthly sales quota. Section 2. The pressure to recruit. To really grasp how these decorated soldiers were pushed to the brink, we have to look at the intense systemic pressures weighing on them from the very top of the military chain of command. This number is key: 80,000. At the time these tragedies were unfolding, the all-volunteer military was fighting 2 simultaneous, prolonged wars. To sustain those efforts, the Army required a massive 80,000 new recruits annually. The initial patriotic surge following 9/11 had faded, leaving recruiters with the agonizing task of trying to sell an increasingly unpopular war to high schoolers and their hesitant parents. To hit those demands, recruiters were forced into absolutely grueling schedules. We're talking 15 to 19 hours a day. They were routinely dialing into mandatory conference calls at 7 a.m. and again at 10 p.m. Many worked 6 or 7 days a week, cold calling up to 150 prospects a day, and spending their rare free time stalking the aisles of 24-hour super Walmarts just hoping to find potential recruits. Plus, the isolation from regular military bases only amplified this relentless stress. Then there was the official expectation handed down by commanders, the impossible slogan, "must do 2." Basically, every recruiter was expected to sign 2 recruits a month. But if you look at the math, if the Army's 7,600 recruiters actually pulled that off, it would generate over 180,000 recruits. That's more than double the 80,000 the Army actually needed. The quota was entirely detached from reality, but recruiters were still punished severely if they failed to meet it. Section 3. A toxic command climate. That constant drumbeat for impossible numbers didn't just stress people out. It actively fostered an incredibly toxic leadership environment. When commanders are rated solely on how well their subordinates recruit, the human element disappears pretty fast. And the documented abuses are just shocking. If you missed your quota, commanders routinely used public berating to break you down. Soldiers were ordered to mandatory Saturday low-production training sessions. They were denied promised time off for their own birthdays or wedding anniversaries. There were constant threats of losing rank, which would effectively destroy careers they had spent years building in combat zones. This first-hand account about Staff Sergeant Larry Flores, given just days before he took his own life, reveals the devastating human toll. This was a man who had deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan, a prideful, squared-away soldier, systematically broken down and humiliated in front of his peers by his own superiors just over a missed quota. Section 4, Desperation and Misconduct. Now, a pressure cooker environment like this didn't just break soldiers mentally. It led to massive systemic breakdowns in morality and discipline across the board. Driven by desperation, this unrelenting pressure sparked a disturbing national trend. We're talking falsified records, forged signatures, and, abhorrently, predatory behavior. As documented in these watchdog reports, institutional failures empowered inexcusable abuses of power, including the horrific exploitation and abuse of minors. And the sheer volume of these reports proves this wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a total collapse of institutional morality. Lawrence Kagawa, a highly decorated recruiter who retired after 20 years in uniform, summed it up perfectly. Because commanders ignored red flags as long as the numbers were met, there was this massive institutional incentive to cut corners. It was a culture that literally forced combat heroes to compromise their integrity just to survive their stateside assignment. Section 5, Investigations and Accountability. Eventually, the mounting tragedies and public reports of misconduct forced an institutional reckoning. The military could no longer look away. So the military was finally forced to take a direct sequence of actions. It kicked off when the Houston newspaper reports caught the attention of Senator John Cornyn, who demanded answers. Brigadier General Frank D. Turner was ordered to investigate the Houston Battalion. The toxic leadership at the top of that battalion was subsequently replaced, and, most significantly, a rare Army-wide stand-down was ordered for all 8,400 recruiters to focus entirely on suicide prevention and leadership training. General Turner's investigation confirmed the grim reality. While pointing to personal relationship issues as factors, the report explicitly cited a poor command climate and a singular focus on production at the expense of soldier and family considerations. As a result, recruiter wellness training became mandatory, and the Army's Inspector General was brought in to assess the command climate of recruiting offices nationwide. Brigadier General James Gilman really hit the nail on the head when discussing the need for proper mental health care for soldiers. Never leave a fallen comrade. This is the military's foundational creed. And as we've seen throughout this explainer, that creed absolutely must apply equally to the invisible psychological wounds inflicted by extreme institutional stress at home, just as much as it does to the physical wounds suffered on the battlefield. Which leaves us with this lingering question. When our service members survive the horrors of war, they deserve to return to a system that supports them. How can our institutions build structural safeguards to protect the mental health and dignity of those who serve, ensuring no other team experiences the heartbreaking losses of Sergeant Rodis's battalion? It's a critical issue we all need to be thinking about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.